Good. So what I'm presenting is a brand new project. This is part of the project I've been on since just the beginning of the year in Oslo. So yeah, brand new paper. I'm very interested to hear your feedback about this project. So what I'll be talking about is as sort of a meta-level comment on the way that ecologists and philosophers of ecology have been thinking about entity realism, about ecological entities. And this is possibly an interesting context for this conference because in ecology, direct manipulation of the study objects is easily possible and very commonly done. So I'll talk about this a little bit. But that hasn't really played any role in how people are reasoning about realism and anti-realism. So I don't know that I have a very good explanation of that, but maybe that's something we can discuss later. I will be talking about responding to what I characterize as a kind of anti-realist consensus or default position. So despite the easy observability and manipulability of these entities, ecologists and philosophers of ecology have been by default anti-realists about them. And so that's what I will be responding to. And this talk is sort of the main arguments that are being made for anti-realism and what I think are some implications of those arguments. And I'll be arguing for a sort of parity thesis, which I'll explain later in the talk. So the entities that I will be focusing on this talk are going to be ecological communities, slash ecosystems, where communities are local groups of interacting populations, and ecosystems are those interacting populations plus their abiotic surroundings, soil, water, and that sort of thing. And as we know, these entities, ecological science covers entities on a variety of scales, including microscopic and like sort of a close to like a whole Earth scale. But most of these objects are kind of straightforwardly medium scale entities that we can directly interact with. You know, these are nearby medium scale entities. You can go swim in a river, for example. That's an ecosystem. And I'll talk a bit more in the next slide. I was asked to talk a little bit more about what kinds of experimental manipulation go on in ecology. Yeah. So I think on the face of it, on the first glance, many people's reaction is that, well, it seems kind of unproblematic. The realism about these entities seems kind of unproblematic. And so it's sort of an interesting puzzle is like why most or many professional ecologists as well as philosophers of ecology have thought that there are serious problems about these entities, which I'll get to later in the talk. So a little background on ecology. I think philosophers who know just a little bit about ecology are probably more familiar with the theoretical side, and the philosophy of ecology has so far focused a bit disproportionately, I would say, on mathematical modeling practices and statistical practices. Ecology is indeed a highly statistically advanced discipline. However, the great majority of the discipline is experimental. Community ecology is primarily an experimental discipline. That's what most ecologists do. Here are some examples of some kind of general sketches of simple kinds of study designs. Ecologists will sometimes go into existing natural communities and cordon off parts of them and then manipulate some of their properties. That might include, for example, like the number of species present. And the purpose of doing this is to try and draw causal inferences. So to try and understand how some properties of communities are causally related to other properties of communities by having these kinds of study designs where you have a bunch of replicates and then you systematically vary a property and see what happens. Yeah, so you can also have sort of targeted interventions on a particular ecosystem, like putting up a fence to exclude deer from part of a forest to see what that does to the forest, again, for the purpose of drawing causal inferences usually. And there's also a common practice of creating artificial communities in laboratory settings, again, with these kind of typical experimental designs aimed to draw causal inferences. So in a way, a lot of these study designs are maybe pretty similar to kinds of experiments that might take place on organisms, for example, for the purpose of causal reasoning. Just have a bunch of replicates and make some kind of different interventions and see what happens causally. So as we know, it's in a way it's kind of easy for us to intervene on communities. What is done, practically speaking, might be kind of similar to what you do if you do landscaping or gardening, right? Removal of or addition of species, installation of barriers, that sort of thing. So this is not necessarily that technology can be, but it's not necessarily super technologically sophisticated. So this might contrast with other areas of science, like perhaps particle physics, where it's a major technological development to be able to intervene on particular entities. That being said, the kinds of study designs, and in particular like the statistical designs of ecological studies, are where there's like a huge amount of scientific innovation. So like a key feature of ecological science is that causal inference has always been extremely difficult in ecology, but it's not because there's a difficulty with like intervening on the entity we want to intervene on. There's not usually a question, if you go dump a bunch of phosphorus in a lake, there's not really a question, did I intervene on the lake? Rather, the causal inference is difficult because of the complexity within ecological systems as well as their heterogeneity. And this has been well characterized by some other philosophers of ecology. So yeah, epistemic difficulties in experimental ecology have more to do on the causal inference and statistical side, less to do with like, did we actually intervene on what we thought we did? So again, contrasts with maybe studies of very small or very distant objects. So yeah, as I said further, this on the face of this might seem to make it seem like there shouldn't be much of a problem about realism. And interestingly, basically since the very beginning of ecology as a discipline, ecology as its own discipline arose in about the 1890s as distinct from zoology and botany as a separate discipline. And from basically the beginning, like the early decades of the last century, there were already controversies about whether what we would now call communities are like real objects. And since the philosophy of ecology picked up, this has again kind of been picked up among philosophers. And the default position is what I am currently calling selective anti-realism. And I realize that might not have been the best term because I know selective realism means something else in another context. But what I mean by this is that these are people who are, in general, entity realists. So these are not global anti-realists. But the people taking this position, so for example, these would be realists about organisms, about other biological entities, about most of the entities probably just talked about in the sciences, whether they're observable or not, but they think that something is specifically metaphysically problematic about ecological entities. So that's what I mean by selective anti-realism here. And yeah, as a sort of meta-level comment, it's interesting that manipulability or right, the centrality of causal reasoning. I mean, causal and mechanistic reasoning is really arguably I think it's fair to say that's the central goal of experimental ecology. And those factors have not seemingly played any role in how people are reasoning about realism, which is interesting to me. I'm not sure why that is. All right, so I will go through now, having set that up, I'll go through now the three main types of argument that I see people making for anti-realism / skepticism / eliminativism. I'll kind of bundle those about entities like communities and ecosystems. And I will argue I find these arguments not to be convincing, and I'll end up arguing for a parity thesis that I'll discuss later. Although my objective here is again kind of a meta level comment on the dialectic. My objective here is not actually to argue for realism. So I'll explain that more later in the talk. Okay. The first argument, and this is what I'll spend the most time on because I think this is the most interesting. So the first argument that a bunch of folks have been making for ecological anti-realism, and this includes, interestingly, this includes both theoretical ecologists, like some of this is coming from some like more philosophically minded ecologists as well as philosophers. This is based on external assembly, so I have to briefly explain what's going on with assembly mechanisms. So in community ecology, assembly mechanisms are processes that explain community structure. Assembly mechanism is the term ecologists use. So assembly mechanisms explain community structure. So what does community structure mean? That means things like the relative abundances of populations in a community. So communities have typical kinds of relative abundance structures. That is basically like they have certain numbers of very common species and certain numbers of very rare species. There's kind of there's a curve you can describe that's typical across communities. And explaining the shape of this curve and other features of other properties of ecological communities is a key explanatory target in both theoretical and experimental ecology. So assembly mechanisms are these processes that are thought to be at work in the world that explain the way populations are, like their abundances, their relative abundances, their geographic distributions, and so forth. Whether or not certain population can coexist, for example. So these include mechanisms like classically, right, there's a lot of thought about competition. Cooperation is also important. So these are functional biological interactions among populations. Movement in space, so the ability of a certain population to move and colonize a new area, which some populations can do more easily than others. I mean, think of like seeds that blow in the wind versus something like, mammals might be more or less mobile. There's also been in the past decades a lot of discussion about ecological drift. Excuse me, I'm just now realizing I can't see the clock. Okay. So there's been a lot of discussion recently about ecological drift, which is sort of parallel-ish to evolutionary drift. And this is basically chancy changes in relative abundances and other community properties resulting from differences in things like birth-death rates that are thought to just be chancy and not related to fitness differences. And yeah, drift can also result from speciation extinction rates as well. So all of these different processes shape and explain the structures and properties of local communities. And all right, so how does this relate then to anti-realism? Ecologists commonly distinguish between external and internal assembly mechanisms. And this is where has been thought to relate to realism. So external assembly mechanisms are mechanisms that somehow intuitively originate outside of a community or are not driven by the biological interactions internal to the community. So these would include things like dispersal rates, right? The rates at which new organisms colonize the community. As well as things like speciation extinction rates, which would be considered sort of a global, there's some sort of global value of the speciation extinction rate that's not considered to arise from these geographically local interactions. And in contrast, internal assembly mechanisms involve biological interactions among the community members that can be characterized as functional or as fitness related or as otherwise kind of involving distinctively ecological local causal interactions of some sort. So the paradigm cases of this would be competition and cooperation. For example, the way populations compete for limited available resources in a location. And here's why this is relevant to realism. So there's kind of a large background theoretical controversy, but there has been over the past decades, there have been arguments that ecological communities are basically more externally assembled than has been previously thought, or that external mechanisms are more important, at least at some scales, than internal mechanisms. And it has further than often been assumed that if it's the case that ecosystems or communities are primarily externally structured, then they're not real. They're not real individuals. This has been, again, often assumed, not always really argued for, sometimes just sort of taken for granted. So I'm not convinced by this argument, but maybe I'll try my best to capture what the intuition is. I think, okay, so here are thoughts on this argument. So I'm not convinced by this, but I think that there is some kind of an intuition here, and the perhaps right, or at least more convincing intuition, is that if something is to be regarded as a real individual, there should be some sort of internal mechanisms like gluing the parts together. So we want to make a distinction between like an actual integrated system and just a heap of parts, right? And the concern is that when we have external assembly mechanisms, what we end up with is more like a heap of parts than an integrated individual system. I am, however, not convinced that this distinction between internal and external assembly mechanisms tracks that intuitive distinction. And the reason is that there are tons of entities, particularly artifacts, that are characteristically externally assembled. And I don't think that people making this argument would be happy with the conclusion that the great majority of artifacts are not real. I mean, again, one can take that position. I'm sort of just I'm addressing these arguments on their own terms. And the way that this has gone is for kind of historical reasons that I won't get into now. There has been often an implicit assumption or like a methodological approach of addressing realism from the perspective of whether ecological entities are similar enough to organisms. And in this respect, they're not. They're dissimilar to organisms. That's been known for a long time. But that seemed okay. I think I'm going to come back to that later in the talk. So I will, for the sake of time, I'll move on. So I have two more anti-realist arguments that I will address more briefly, and then come back to my more positive claims. Okay. Second one, go through briefly. There's been a lot of concern that most ecological communities are thought to have extremely fuzzy or unclear boundaries, to the point that it's just futile to really try to individuate them. This is an example of a kind of mixed savanna. So we have, if you kind of walk this way for a long ways, you'll end up in a forest. And maybe if you walk this way for a long ways, you end up in just a grassland. And we have here some sort of intermediate thing, which is patchy, right? We've got grassland and tree patches. And if you wanted to draw a line in space between where the forest ends and the grassland starts, that seems kind of problematic. Okay. So I think that's a fair point to make in some cases, and that's a challenge for some kinds of ecological research. My view in general, though, is that the extent to which ecological entities lack any sort of clear boundary has been overstated. I think there actually are quite a lot of particularly ecosystems. Communities admittedly are harder, but particularly ecosystems, there are quite a lot that do have like very clear visible boundaries in space. These boundaries are indeed, studied by ecologists as sort of their own like ecologically interesting entities in their own rights. So I think to some extent that the this being like an unsurmountable problem, I think has been overstated. And one might also point out, as we were discussing last night at dinner, that like most natural objects seem to have fuzzy boundaries to some degree. So I'm not sure how overwhelming this point ought to be. Okay. So the third kind of argument that is often made, and I'm taking this primarily from an ecologist, actually, Kurt Yaks, is these kinds of ontological problems that are thought by realists to arise due to the fact that there are quite a lot of mutually inconsistent ways to go about individuating communities and ecosystems in practice. And so this is thought to result in several distinct puzzles. One being that if we sort of accept all these different methods that are in play, we end up with a lot of cross-cutting entities, which seems kind of messy to some people. This also results in counting inconsistencies. So some people are very troubled that this is problematic if we can't really say like how many ecosystems are there, or if different ways of counting give quite different answers. There's also been a lot of concern about ontological bloat, basically the problem being that we will have to accept like all of the potential ways of delimiting communities and ecosystems, then we end up with just like too many entities. And so some people have argued for just kind of general conventionalism about all of these ways of delimiting ecosystems and communities as a way to prevent this kind of ontological bloat for people who have the intuition that ontological bloat is a problem. I don't, incidentally, but I'm not going to make that argument here. I'm not sure I have an argument. That's just an intuition difference. Okay. Now, what again strikes me as a little bit odd internal to this, the way this discussion is going, is that again, most of these people are realists about most of biology. So they're already realists about like all of the cells on Earth, which is just an exceptionally enormous amount of entities. They're realists about all of the organisms on Earth. They're realists probably about all of the species, including all of the many different ways of delimiting species. I'm not sure at that point. It's at that point you already have a bloated ontology. I'm not sure that adding some ecological entities is such a huge like sacrifice. Okay, and then my main reason. I need to speed up. Okay, so my main reason for that I will argue now for this parity thesis is that all of these problems apply to all of biology. And so there seems kind of, to me, a tension in applying these arguments just to ecological entities while being realist about the rest of biology. All right. To just, so to summarize what I think is going on with these arguments, the first argument based on this difference between external and internal assembly, this is basically being driven by the view that that organisms are paradigm biological objects, and that if ecosystems, for example, are to be real, they ought to be relevantly similar to organisms. I find this argument unconvincing as an argument for realism, given that there are presumably a whole lot of entities that are not similar to organisms. That seems to be just kind of an arbitrary benchmark, which does have, this has historical reasons for it. But I think that this project of like comparing ecosystems and organisms ought to just be dropped. I think it's not helpful anymore. On the other hand, folks have made arguments for anti-realists anti-realism based on these features like boundary problems, individuation problems, counting problems, ontological bloat, and all of these problems are known to apply in basically the exact same way, sometimes in worse ways, to basically all of biology, to organisms, to genes, to species, and so forth. Now, in the discussion about ecology, people have similarly have seemingly not noticed this. And so that's kind of one of my main aim is trying to point this out, right? People have not noticed that it's probably inconsistent to accept these as arguments for anti-realism about ecology while being entity realist in general about most of biology. How much more do I have? I'll just go over this quickly. I think I don't want to talk for too much longer. I had just put, for folks who don't work on biology, I just had a slide to try and make plausible that all of these problems do indeed apply to organisms. These things like counting, there's a huge literature on the problem of individuating organisms in the philosophy of biology. And all of these same like counting and definition problems apply to organisms just as badly as they apply to ecosystems or communities. This is just this is a clonal aspen. So these are ecologically speaking, this is a forest with a whole bunch of trees, but genetically and evolutionarily speaking, these are all genetic clones of one another. So evolutionarily speaking, you might say this is a single giant individual. That's just an illustration of one kind of common counting problem that goes on with respect to biological organisms. Another interesting case, over half our cells, it seems, aren't genetically human, which either means that we're half not genetically human, maybe it means that we're communities, as well as organisms. If that's the case, then presumably whatever metaphysical problems arise for communities also must arise for organisms. Okay. So the parity thesis I'm arguing for is people who are entity anti-realists about ecology should be more global anti-realists, at least about biology, particularly about organisms. Those who are realists, who are happy to be realists about organisms, should also be realists about ecological entities. Again, the only main difference that has been characterized is this difference between the relative importance of internal versus external assembly mechanisms. And I'm not convinced that that distinction per se is a good basis for tracking realism. Although maybe folks have some ideas about how to strengthen that argument. I think also just as a general comment, people who find like manipulability or causal relevance, causal reasoning as good reasons for entity realism have maybe kind of a weird case in ecology. It seems like that might cause people to accept like a really inclusive biological ontology, since biologists do all sorts of manipulationist experiments on all sorts of metaphysically strange objects. I also think there's maybe a bit of a puzzle for these people who are realists about organisms but not about ecological objects. There might be a bit of a puzzle for them for explaining why like the same kinds of experimental designs and causal reasoning work in both cases. That seems potentially a bit of a puzzle. All right, how am I doing? Okay, good. So again, there's been kind of a background in the literature of assuming that ecological entities ought to behave similar to organisms, or that ecological science ought to be more like regular biology, whatever that means. And to the extent to which ecological systems differ from organismal biology, this is evidence that we're not hooking onto like real objects in the world. I think this is just a problematic setup for the discussion. We've known in ecology for a long time that ecological dynamics are quite different to organismal development. So for people who are inclined to realism in the first place, this really stacks the deck against ecological entities and makes it seem as if something is going wrong in particular with ecology rather than sort of just treating it as its own science. I think in general, like this would be a strange way to reason about like, I don't know, particle physics or cosmology or something, would be to ask like, is this similar to an organism? Again, there are historical reasons why this happens with respect to ecology, but I think it's not warranted. Yeah. So I said what I'm addressing here, I put exceptionalism, but I mean that in sort of in a negative sense here. What I'm concerned with is this position that ecology is sort of exceptionally bad as compared to the rest of biology in conceptual or metaphysical or sometimes methodological terms. Yeah. I'm actually, I think I'm on record. I'm actually not a scientific realist, so I'm not actually trying to defend realism here, but rather make this kind of intervention internal to the way I see this dialectic going. So I will just conclude really fast. There has been, as another higher level comment, a lot of philosophers have published kind of skeptical arguments about the core ecological concepts. A lot of times there seems to be this implication that ecology as a science is failing to hook onto real components of the world. There's something kind of uniquely conceptually wrong with ecology. These concepts are in fact very metaphysically challenging to interpret like what they're referring to in the world. Nonetheless, it is the case that there is a huge and thriving experimental program in ecology addressing all of these entities / concepts. And so my general orientation is to suggest that this may point to more of a practice-oriented approach of if we're getting stuck on like the metaphysics or the realism, maybe rather than concluding ecology has failed, look more about at how these concepts are working successfully, I would argue, within experimental practices. Thank you.